right now, at this exact moment. There's a version of you living in a parallel universe who didn't waste the last 6 months scrolling through social media and putting off the important work, and that version of you has already built the business, written the book, gotten in shape, developed the skills that you keep telling yourself you'll start tomorrow. And the gap between you and that parallel version isn't talent or intelligence or resources, it's the fact that they figured out how to overcome the single most destructive force in modern life, which is procrastination. And here's what nobody tells you. Procrastination isn't a time management problem. It's not a motivation problem. It's not even a laziness problem. It's a deeply rooted psychological defense mechanism that your brain uses to protect you from discomfort. And until you understand the actual root cause and have specific strategies to interrupt the pattern, you're going to keep cycling through the same loop of intention, delay, guilt, and self-sabotage that's been stealing your potential for years. The ancient Stoics dealt with procrastination at a level that would destroy most modern people. Marcus Aurelius had to rule an entire empire while dealing with plagues and wars and assassination attempts. And every single morning, he had to fight the urge to stay in his comfortable bed instead of facing the overwhelming responsibilities waiting for him. But he developed 5 specific mental tools that allowed him to take action consistently even when every fiber of his being wanted to avoid the discomfort. And those same 5 tools work just as effectively today for overcoming procrastination on your goals. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why you procrastinate on the things that matter most. And you're going to have 5 battle-tested Stoic strategies that will transform you from someone who talks about what they're going to do into someone who simply does it regardless of how they feel in the moment. And this isn't motivational fluff that worked for 24 hours. This is a complete rewiring of how you relate to discomfort and action. Now, before we dive into these 5 tips that are going to permanently change your relationship with procrastination, I need to tell you about something that's going to accelerate this entire transformation exponentially. And that's the subconscious millionaire system that I've linked in the description. Because here's the truth that will save you years of frustration. Procrastination is not a conscious choice that you can simply willpower your way through. It's a subconscious pattern that got installed during childhood and reinforced over decades. And your subconscious mind is running automatic programs that make you avoid important tasks without you even realizing why. And until you reprogram those subconscious patterns, you're going to keep procrastinating no matter how many productivity tips you learn or how badly you want to change. That system gives you the exact framework for identifying and rewriting the subconscious programs that drive procrastination. So instead of constantly battling yourself, you become someone who naturally takes action without internal resistance. So check out that link after this video if you're serious about making this permanent. But right now, let's talk about the first Stoic tip that explains why procrastination happens and how to interrupt it at the source. The first Stoic tip is understanding that procrastination is not about the task itself. It's about avoiding the uncomfortable emotions associated with starting the task. And this distinction changes everything because most people are trying to solve the wrong problem. They're trying to find motivation or manage their time better when the actual problem is that they haven't learned how to sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for escape. Epictetus teaches that we're not disturbed by things, but by our judgments about things. And when you apply this to procrastination, you realize that you're not actually avoiding the work. You're avoiding the feeling of inadequacy that comes up when you imagine not doing it perfectly, or the feeling of overwhelm when you think about how much there is to do, or the feeling of vulnerability that comes with putting yourself out there and potentially failing. Marcus Aurelius writes in his meditations about the resistance he felt every morning to getting out of bed and facing his duties. And his solution wasn't to try to feel motivated. It was to recognize that the discomfort of starting is temporary, but the regret of not starting is permanent. And he trained himself to act in spite of the discomfort rather than waiting for the discomfort to disappear. Here's what's actually happening in your brain when you procrastinate. Your amygdala, which is the primitive part of your brain responsible for threat detection, perceives the difficult task as a threat to your ego or your comfort, and it triggers a stress response that makes you want to avoid the task. And then your prefrontal cortex, which is supposed to override that impulse with rational thinking, gets hijacked by the immediate relief that comes from avoiding the discomfort. So you choose the instant gratification of scrolling social media or watching videos over the delayed gratification of making progress on your goals. The second Stoic tip is practicing what Marcus Aurelius called the discipline of action, which means you train yourself to start immediately without negotiation, without waiting for the right mood, without extensive preparation. You simply begin the moment you know something needs to be done. And this might sound simplistic, but it's actually the most powerful habit you can develop, because procrastination lives in the gap between knowing what you should do and actually doing it. And the longer that gap exists, the more time your brain has to generate excuses and rationalize avoidance. Marcus Aurelius had a specific practice where when he woke up and felt resistance to starting his day, he would remind himself that he was born to do this work, that this is what human beings are designed for, and that lying in bed feeling comfortable while the work waits is actually more painful in the long run than getting up and doing what needs to be done. And he would count to 3 and then immediately take action before his mind could generate more resistance. The key insight here is that motivation is not a prerequisite for action. It's a result of action. You don't wait until you feel like doing something. You start doing it and the motivation follows. And this completely flips the script that most people operate from, where they're waiting for inspiration or energy or the perfect conditions before they begin. Epictetus taught his students to practice what he called the reserve clause, which means you commit to the action but not to the outcome. So instead of saying, I'm going to write the entire chapter today, which feels overwhelming and creates resistance, you say, I'm going to write for 15 minutes and see what happens. And what you'll find is that starting is the hardest part, but once your momentum builds, and you often continue way past the minimum commitment because the psychological friction only exists at the beginning. The Stoics understood something about human psychology that modern research has confirmed through studies on the Zeigarnik effect. Once you start a task, your brain wants to complete it. There's psychological tension in leaving things unfinished. So the most effective way to overcome procrastination is to make the barrier to starting as low as possible. You commit to the smallest possible action that moves you forward, and you do it immediately before your brain can talk you out of it. Seneca writes that it's not that we have too little time, it's that we waste too much of it. And most of that waste happens in the transition periods where we're debating whether to start scrolling mindlessly or doing busy work that feels productive but doesn't actually move us toward our goals. That here's the tactical implementation that will change your life if you actually do it. Identify the one task that would make the biggest difference in your life if you did it consistently, and commit to starting that task within 5 minutes of waking up every single day before you check your phone, before you check email, before you do anything else. And the commitment is just a start, even if it's only for 10 minutes. And what you'll discover is that those 10 minutes almost always turn into 30 or 60 because the resistance was only in the starting, not in the doing. Marcus Aurelius practiced this with his imperial duties. He would handle the most difficult and important decisions first thing in the morning when his willpower was highest. And he would save the easier administrative tasks for later in the day when his decision-making capacity was depleted. And this strategic sequencing meant that the things that mattered most always got done regardless of how he felt. And that's the ultimate goal of this discipline, to become someone whose important work happens consistently regardless of mood or circumstances. And this is exactly where the subconscious millionaire system becomes absolutely critical, because what we're really talking about is reprogramming your default response to important tasks from avoidance to immediate action. And that's not something you can just decide to do consciously. It requires rewiring the subconscious patterns that make procrastination feel like the path of least resistance. That system gives you specific techniques for installing new subconscious programs where taking action on your goals feels natural and automatic instead of requiring constant willpower and self-discipline. And when you combine these Stoa practices with that deep subconscious work, you create a transformation where procrastination literally stops being a problem because your subconscious is aligned with your conscious goals instead of fighting against them. So make sure you check that out in the description if you want to make this permanent instead of just temporary. But let's keep going, because the next tip is where this gets really transformative. The third Stoic tip is using memento mori, the meditation on death, to create genuine urgency around your goals and eliminate the illusion that you have unlimited time to procrastinate. And this might sound dark, but it's actually the most clarifying and motivating practice you can develop, because most procrastination is based on the unconscious assumption that you'll have time to do it later, that there will always be another tomorrow, another week, another year to finally start working on what matters. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that he could die at any moment, that this day might be his last. And from that perspective, wasting time on trivial distractions or avoiding important work because it's uncomfortable becomes absurd, because if you knew with certainty that you only had 1 year left to live, would you spend even one more day procrastinating on your dreams? Would you waste another hour scrolling social media or watching content that doesn't improve your life, or would you immediately start taking massive action on the things that actually matter to you? The Stoics practice this not to be morbid or pessimistic, but to gain perspective on what's truly important and to create the kind of urgency that cuts through all the excuses and rationalization that procrastination feeds on. Seneca writes that we act as if we're going to live forever. We put off the things that matter while attending to trivial urgent things. And then we reach old age and realize we wasted our entire life on things that didn't matter while the important stuff never got done. And the tragedy is that it's completely preventable if you just acknowledge the reality of your mortality and use it as fuel for action. Here's the practical application that will transform your relationship with time. Every morning when you wake up, before you do anything else, you spend 60 seconds visualizing yourself on your deathbed, looking back at your life. And you ask yourself, if I died tonight, would I be proud of how I spent today? Would I regret the time I wasted procrastinating? Would I wish I had taken action on the things that scared me instead of playing it safe? And then you use that clarity to make decisions about what deserves your time and energy today. The Stoics also practiced negative visualization, where they imagined losing everything they have, their health, their opportunities, their abilities, and this practice creates profound gratitude for what's available to you right now and eliminates the tendency to take your opportunities for granted by assuming they'll always be there. Marcus Aurelius writes that you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. And what he's pointing to is this radical honesty about the finite nature of your existence that makes procrastination seem like the absurd waste that it actually is, because every day you procrastinate is a day of your one precious life that you've chosen to throw away, and you can't get it back. It's gone forever. And the compound effect of wasted days becomes wasted years and eventually a wasted life. The goal of memento mori is not to create anxiety or fear about death. It's to create clarity and urgency about life, to wake you up from the trance of thinking you have unlimited time and to help you prioritize what actually matters. And when you combine this practice with the previous tips about understanding procrastination and starting immediately, you create an unstoppable combination where you're not just avoiding procrastination. You're actively choosing purposeful action because you recognize that your time is the most valuable non-renewable resource you have. The fourth Stoic tip is applying the dichotomy of control specifically to overcome procrastination by focusing entirely on effort and process while releasing attachment to outcomes. And this is crucial because a lot of procrastination comes from perfectionism and fear of failure. You don't start because you're afraid it won't be good enough, or you'll be judged, or you'll discover you're not as capable as you thought. But the Stoics understood that outcomes are outside your direct control, while effort and intention are completely within your control. And once you shift your focus to what you can control, procrastination loses most of its power. Epictetus teaches that you should never tie your worth or happiness to results, because results depend on countless factors outside your control, including luck, timing, other people's decisions, market conditions, but you can always control whether you showed up and gave your best effort. And that's where your self-respect should come from. Not from winning or achieving, but from consistently doing what you said you would do regardless of external validation. Marcus Aurelius applied this constantly in his role as emperor, where he had to make decisions knowing that many would fail despite his best efforts. and his practice was to focus entirely on making the best decision he could with the information available, and then accepting whatever outcome followed without taking it personally or using it as evidence of his worth. And that detachment from outcomes actually made him more effective because he wasn't paralyzed by fear of failure. He was free to experiment and learn and adjust. Here's how this eliminates procrastination. Instead of procrastinating because you're afraid your work won't be perfect, you shift your goal to simply producing the work and learning from it. You commit to showing up and putting in focused effort for a specific amount of time, and you release attachment to whether that effort produces the exact result you wanted. Because you recognize that the only way to improve is through consistent imperfect action, not through waiting until you're good. Enough to start. Seneca writes that it's not because things are difficult that we don't dare, it's because we don't dare that things are difficult. And what he means is that procrastination makes tasks harder by allowing fear and doubt to build up. But once you start taking action, you realize most tasks are far more manageable than your imagination made them seem. The practical technique is to set process goals instead of outcome goals. So instead of saying, I'm going to write a best-selling book, which is outside your control and creates massive pressure, you say, I'm going to write for 1 hour every morning, which is completely within your control. And you judge your success based on whether you honored that commitment, not on whether the writing was brilliant or whether anyone liked it. Because those are different questions. What happens through this practice is that you're training yourself to find satisfaction in the process of showing up and doing the work. And paradoxically, this often leads to better outcomes because you're producing more volume, you're learning faster, you're not blocked by perfectionism. But even if the outcomes aren't what you hope for, you still have the deep satisfaction of knowing you gave your effort, which is something nobody can take from you. Marcus Aurelius reminds himself constantly that the reward for doing good work is having done good work, not external recognition or achievement. And when you internalize that perspective, procrastination becomes illogical because you're not waiting for perfect conditions or guaranteed success. You're just showing up to do what's within your control and allowing the results to take care of themselves. The fifth and final Stoic tip is practicing voluntary discomfort to build your tolerance for the uncomfortable feelings that trigger procrastination. And this is the most advanced practice, but also the most transformative because it directly addresses the root cause of procrastination, which is discomfort avoidance. And if you can train yourself to not only tolerate discomfort, but actually seek it out, procrastination becomes impossible because you're no longer running from the feelings that trigger avoidance patterns. The Stoics regularly practiced voluntary hardship, where they would deliberately expose themselves to uncomfortable situations that they weren't required to face. Seneca would practice poverty by living on minimal food and basic accommodations for a few days each month. Marcus Aurelius would practice cold exposure and physical discomfort. Epictetus taught his students to practice social discomfort by saying and doing things that might invite judgment or rejection. And the purpose of all these practices wasn't to suffer for suffering's sake. It was to prove to themselves that discomfort is not dangerous, that they could handle whatever life threw at them, and that expanded their window of tolerance so that normal challenging tasks felt manageable by comparison. Here's how this applies to overcoming procrastination. You deliberately practice doing things that make you uncomfortable before you're required to do them. So if you procrastinate on important phone calls, you start making random phone calls just to practice feeling awkward and pushing through it. If you procrastinate on writing because you're afraid of judgment, you start posting your rough drafts publicly just to desensitize yourself to criticism. If you procrastinate on physical challenges, you start doing cold showers or difficult workouts to prove you can handle discomfort. And what happens is that your baseline for what feels uncomfortable shifts dramatically, and tasks that used to trigger procrastination now feel easy by comparison. Marcus Aurelius writes that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And what he's pointing to is this principle that the very thing you're avoiding is actually your path forward. The discomfort you're running from is the training ground for becoming the person who no longer procrastinates. The tactical implementation is to create a voluntary discomfort practice that you do every single day, something that makes you uncomfortable, but that you choose to do anyway to build your discomfort tolerance muscle. And this could be cold showers, difficult conversations, public speaking practice, sharing your work before it's perfect, doing the hardest task first thing in the morning. Anything that requires you to override your comfort-seeking impulses and take action despite resistance. What you'll discover through consistent practice is that the resistance to starting tasks decreases dramatically because you've proven to yourself repeatedly that you can do hard things, that discomfort doesn't control you, that you're capable of acting regardless of how you feel, and that fundamental shift in identity from someone who avoids discomfort to someone who embraces it is what permanently eliminates procrastination. Seneca writes that difficulties strengthen the mind as labor does the body, and procrastination is ultimately a weakness of mind that comes from avoiding the mental labor of pushing through resistance. But when you deliberately practice that mental labor through voluntary discomfort, you build psychological strength that makes procrastination impossible, because you're no longer someone who runs from hard things. You're someone who runs toward them. So let's bring all 5 Stoic tips together into a complete system for permanently overcoming procrastination. First, understand that procrastination is about avoiding uncomfortable emotions, not about the task itself, and practice sitting with those emotions instead of running from them. Second, develop the discipline of immediate action by starting within 5 minutes of knowing something needs to be done without waiting for motivation or perfect conditions. Third, use memento mori to create genuine urgency by remembering that your time is finite, and every day you procrastinate is a day of your life you're choosing to waste. Fourth, apply the dichotomy of control by focusing on effort and process while releasing attachment to outcomes so perfectionism can't paralyze you. And fifth, practice voluntary discomfort to expand your tolerance for the uncomfortable feelings that trigger avoidance, so that important tasks feel manageable by comparison. These 5 tips work together as a complete framework that addresses procrastination from every angle: psychological, philosophical, behavioral, and emotional. And when you implement all 5 consistently, procrastination stops being this overwhelming force and becomes just another temporary feeling that you know how to handle. Now here's what separates people who watch this video and feel inspired for a day from people who actually transform their lives: implementation. And implementation requires more than just conscious effort, because procrastination is driven by subconscious patterns that have been reinforced for decades. And until you reprogram those subconscious patterns, you're going to keep defaulting back to avoidance, no matter how much you understand these Stoic principles intellectually. This is exactly why the subconscious millionaire system that I've linked in the description is absolutely essential for anyone serious about permanently eliminating procrastination, because that system gives you the specific techniques for identifying and rewiring the subconscious programs that make you avoid important tasks, whether that's fear of failure, fear of success, perfectionism, low self-worth, or any of the other deep patterns that trigger procrastination. And when you combine these 5 Stoic tips with that subconscious reprogramming work, you create a transformation where taking action becomes your natural default instead of something you have to force yourself to do. The difference between your life 1 year from now and your life today is determined entirely by what you do with the information in this video. You can watch it, feel inspired, and then go back to procrastinating tomorrow, or you can click that link right now, get the subconscious millionaire system, and commit to doing the deep work that makes this transformation permanent. And I'm telling you that the investment you make in that system will pay returns for the rest of your life in the form of goals achieved, dreams realized, and the deep satisfaction of becoming someone who does what they say they're going to do. Subscribe to this channel if you want more ancient wisdom combined with modern psychology to help you build the discipline and mental strength that most people never develop, because the world doesn't need more people with good intentions. It needs people who take action, and that's exactly what these Stoic principles will help you become if you actually implement them starting today.